Florence 1513. A man is sitting in his farmhouse outside the city, broke, humiliated, and recently released from prison where he had been strung up by his wrists and tortured. He is 43 years old, unemployed for the first time in his adult life, and the government that tortured him has made clear he is never coming back. So he does the only thing he has left. He picks up a pen. What he writes in the next few months will be placed on the Catholic Church's list of forbidden books, will be credited with inventing modern political science, and will turn his name into an adjective meaning cynical, scheming, and ruthless. None of that is entirely fair, but none of it is entirely wrong either. To understand why Niccolò Machiavelli ended up in a torture chamber, you have to understand what he was before he got there, which was, in a word, indispensable. From 1498 to 1512, he served as second chancellor of the Florentine Republic. The title sounds modest. The job was not. He was the Republic's chief political operator, drafting policy, conducting diplomatic missions, reorganizing the city's military, and shuttling between the courts of kings, popes, and condottieri, the mercenary warlords who were the era's great destabilizing force. He met Cesare Borgia 3 times. He watched Louis XII of France maneuver troops across northern Italy. He sat with the Holy Roman Emperor's representatives and took careful, meticulous notes. Everything he observed went into dispatches, reports, and memoranda. 14 years of hard, close-up schooling in how power actually operates when no one is writing the official history. He was not a philosopher theorizing from a library. He was a practitioner recording what he saw. That distinction matters enormously when you read The Prince. The book is not a fantasy of power. It is, in many ways, a very tired man's field notes. The Republic fell in September 1512. The Medici family, who had ruled Florence for most of the 15th century before being expelled in 1494, returned on the back of a Spanish army. The Republic was dissolved. The new government began, as new governments do, by removing anyone associated with the old one. Machiavelli was dismissed from his post, stripped of his offices, and banned from the palazzo for 1 year. That was in November. In February 1513, he was arrested on suspicion of involvement in an anti-Medici conspiracy. The evidence against him was thin. His name had appeared on a list found in the possession of the actual conspirators, and that was more or less it. He was imprisoned in the Bargello, Florence's forbidding stone jail, and subjected to the strappado, hands tied behind the back, hoisted by a rope from a pulley, then dropped, not quite to the floor. The shoulders dislocate. Machiavelli endured it 4 times and confessed nothing, because there was nothing to confess. He was released in March 1513 when a new pope, Leo X, himself a Medici, declared a general amnesty. He walked out of the Bargello, went to his small family farm in the village of Sant'Andrea in Pecussina, and did not leave for years. What we know about Machiavelli's life at Sant'Andrea comes largely from a letter he wrote to his friend Francesco Vettori in December 1513, one of the most extraordinary letters in the Italian literary tradition. He describes his days with the particular honesty of a man with nothing left to perform for. In the morning, he rises and tends to the woodcutters on his property. He reads Dante and Petrarch. He walks to the local inn and plays cards and backgammon with the miller and a butcher, bickering over pennies. Then in the evening he goes home, takes off his muddy working clothes and changes, and here is the line that stops you cold. He changes into his formal court robes, his ambassadorial dress. He sits down at his desk in the clothes of the official he no longer is, and he reads the ancient historians, Livy, Thucydides, Polybius. He asks them, he says, why they acted as they did. And they answer him, that ritual, the costume change at the desk, tells you everything about what the prince is and what it cost him to write it. It was not written from power, it was written from its absolute absence. The Prince is short, shockingly short for a text of such reputation, roughly 40 pages in most modern editions, and its central argument, stripped of centuries of controversy, is almost brutally simple. The world of politics operates by different rules than the world of private morality, and a ruler who fails to understand that distinction will not survive. Machiavelli is not celebrating cruelty, he is anatomizing it. He makes a distinction that most people who quote him never reach, between cruelty used well, swiftly, decisively, to establish order, and cruelty used badly, which is to say, continuously, as a habit of governance. The first, he argues, can be forgiven. The second destroys everything. His most notorious passage concerns whether it is better to be loved or feared. The usual answer given is feared. The actual passage says something more careful. It is best to be both, but since the two rarely coexist, it is safer to be feared than loved, provided the fear never tips into hatred. The word hatred appears more often in The Prince than the word power. That is not an accident. The rulers Machiavelli watched most closely, Caesar Borgia, for instance, fell not because they were ruthless, but because they made enemies who could not be appeased. He was writing a manual on survival, not a manual on evil. The difference has been getting lost for 500 years. Machiavelli wrote The Prince as a job application. That is not a metaphor. He dedicated it to Lorenzo de' Medici, the young grandson of the great Lorenzo, who had recently been installed as ruler of Florence, and his accompanying letter is almost painful to read. He explains, with precise and slightly desperate logic, that a man of low station can offer a great prince no more useful gift than an understanding of the powerful, which only someone who has spent years in the rooms where power operates can provide. He is asking to be let back in. He never was. Lorenzo received the manuscript, thanked him perfunctorily, if he thanked him at all. Sources differ on this point, and the diplomatic historians are careful not to overstate it, and returned to his own affairs. The Prince circulated in manuscript for Machiavelli's lifetime. It was not published until 1532, 5 years after Machiavelli died, still poor, still largely excluded from Florentine political life, still writing furiously, histories, plays, poems, diplomatic analyses. The dedicatee never employed him. The Pope he worked briefly for was uninterested in his advice. The book that would eventually be placed on the index of forbidden books and attributed to the devil himself went out into the world without its author ever seeing it printed. The transformation of Machiavelli into Machiavellian is one of the strangest stories in the history of ideas. It happened remarkably fast. The Prince was published in 1532. By the 1550s, the English were already using Machiavel as a theatrical villain type, scheming, irreligious, delighting in his own manipulation. Christopher Marlowe would give the prologue of his play, The Jew of Malta, to the ghost of Machiavelli, strutting and leering. Cardinal Reginald Pole, the English Catholic, had declared as early as the 1530s that the book read as though it had been written by the finger of Satan. The Catholic Church placed it on the index in 1559. Protestant reformers condemned it, and yet every major European court owned a copy. Cardinal Richelieu is said, this is legend, not documented fact, to have slept with it under his pillow. Frederick the Great of Prussia wrote a refutation of it in his youth, then governed in a manner many observers found thoroughly Machiavellian in his prime. That gap between the public condemnation and the private readership is itself the most Machiavellian thing about the book's reception. What Machiavelli had argued, calmly and without apology, was that the affective and the moral are two separate ledgers. Europeans were not ready to hear that said aloud. They were perfectly happy to act on it in private. Here is what most people who cite The Prince have not read, the last chapter. After 25 chapters of cold-eyed political anatomy, Machiavelli suddenly breaks. He writes an exhortation, an actual appeal to the passions, calling on a new Italian prince to rise up, unite the fragmented peninsula, and drive out the foreign armies that have been tearing it apart for 20 years. He quotes Petrarch. He reaches for the language of salvation. The mask, if it was ever a mask, slips completely. The man who told you that a ruler must learn how not to be good turns out to have been grieving for a world that was not good, and hoping, against his own analysis, for something better. That chapter is why scholars argue so furiously about what Machiavelli actually believed. Was he a cold cynic who couldn't help himself at the end? A moralist who chose a different path to morality? A patriot who happened to be also a realist? The text does not resolve this. That is precisely why it is still worth reading, because the book that everyone thinks they know, The Villain's Handbook, the smirking guide to manipulation, turns out to be something far more uncomfortable than that. It is a document of disillusionment that refuses to surrender entirely to despair. Machiavelli had watched the beautiful institutions of the Florentine Republic crumble in an afternoon. He knew what idealism without realism costs. He paid that bill personally, strung up from his own city's ceiling, and yet the last words of the prince reach, in spite of everything, for hope. That tension, unflinching about how power works, still unable to stop wishing it worked differently, is not a flaw. It is the most honest thing about him, and it is the thing the reputation has buried entirely. The question, perhaps, is this: if you had seen what Machiavelli saw and suffered what he suffered, do you think you would have kept that last chapter in or taken it out?